In the merciless winter of Wyoming Territory, 1875, a young widow shivers against the biting wind, cast out by settlers who once called her neighbor. Her thin shawl offers little protection as darkness falls and snow begins to drift. Hope fades with each stumbling step, frostbite creeping through her trembling fingers, but fate has other plans. Through the swirling snow, a wealthy cattleman spots her silhouette against the pristine drifts. What he offers goes beyond mere shelter. It's a chance at a new life, a new love, and perhaps even a new family. But can a heart frozen by betrayal learn to trust again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Miller's fingers traced the faded ink on the homestead deed, remembering the pride in James's eyes when he'd first shown it to her. "Our own piece of heaven," he'd said, his rough farmer's hands gentle as he'd helped her down from the wagon. That spring morning, the cabin had been little more than 4 walls and a roof then, but to them it had been the beginning of everything. Now, 2 years later, she sat alone at their small table, the January wind howling through gaps in the logs they'd never quite managed to seal. The deed meant nothing now, not without James, not without money to pay the property taxes, and certainly not without the goodwill of neighbors who'd turned their backs one by one. The fever had taken James quickly, too quickly for anyone to help. She'd watched helplessly as it consumed him over 3 days, his strong frame burning with heat despite the winter's chill. Dr. Henderson hadn't even made it out to see them. Someone else's child had taken priority, they'd said. By the time he'd arrived, James was already gone, leaving Sarah with nothing but memories and dwindling supplies. She'd sold what she could, James's tools, their extra blankets, even her mother's silver brooch. Each sale had bought her a little more time, a few more weeks of uncertain shelter. But now, with the last of their savings gone, and the tax collector's deadline looming, even that borrowed time had run out. The settlers' council meeting that morning had been mere formality. Sarah knew her fate was sealed the moment she walked into the church and saw Martha Henderson's pinched expression. The doctor's wife had never approved of James marrying a girl from back east, especially one with fancy ideas about books and education. "Mrs. Miller," Elder Thompson had begun, his voice carrying all the warmth of the frost coating the windows. "We've discussed your situation at length." He'd paused, making a show of shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "While we sympathize with your loss, we cannot allow you to remain in possession of land you cannot maintain. The territory needs strong, productive homesteads." "I can maintain it," Sarah had interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I just need time to—" "A woman alone cannot run a homestead," Martha Henderson had cut in, her knitting needles clicking like angry insects. "It's not natural, not proper." The council had nodded in unified agreement. A sea of faces she'd known for 2 years turned suddenly foreign and cold. These were people who'd shared her table, who'd celebrated harvest with them, who'd praised James's carpentry and her preserves. Now they looked at her as if she were a stranger, or worse, a burden to be shed. "The decision is final," Elder Thompson had declared. "The property will be reassigned to the Whitman family. They have 4 strong sons. They'll make proper use of it." His eyes had softened momentarily, perhaps remembering the girl who'd taught his youngest to read last summer. "You have until sundown to collect your personal belongings. The church can provide you passage to Cheyenne on tomorrow's supply wagon." But Sarah knew what awaited in Cheyenne, the same fate that befell most widows without family or means, the workhouse or worse. She'd heard whispers about the positions available to desperate women, had seen the haunted eyes of girls who'd taken that path. Now, as afternoon light faded to evening's grey, Sarah gathered what little remained of her life into a small carpet bag. Her wedding ring, too precious to sell even now. A daguerreotype of her parents, taken before the consumption, claimed them. The book of poetry James had courted her with, his clumsy farmer's hand inscribing "To my dearest Sarah" on the flyleaf. The sound of boots on her porch startled her from her reverie. Elder Thompson stood in the doorway, several of the younger, men behind him. "It's time, Mrs. Miller." Sarah straightened her spine, refusing to let them see her tremble. She pulled her thin shawl, the last gift Martha Henderson had given her in what now felt like another lifetime, tighter around her shoulders. Without a word, she walked past them into the gathering dusk, the snow already beginning to fall. Behind her, she heard the scrape of furniture being moved, the casual chatter of men dismantling what remained of her life. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. Instead, she fixed her eyes on the road leading north, away from the settlement, away from betrayal, away from everything she'd once called home. The wind picked up, carrying the first bite of the storm to come. The storm grew teeth as darkness fell. Sarah pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, but the wind found every gap, every worn thread, stealing what little warmth remained. The rough wool that had once seemed so fine, Martha Henderson's smug smile as she'd presented it as a Christmas gift, now felt like little more than gossamer against the Wyoming winter. She'd been walking for hours, though the exact count had been lost to the numbing cold. The road north had disappeared beneath the drifting snow, leaving her to navigate by instinct and the occasional glimpse of stars through breaks in the clouds. Each step required more effort than the last, her boots heavy with packed snow. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice lost in the wind. "Just keep moving." The words became a rhythm, matching her stumbling pace. She'd heard stories of people who'd stopped in storms like this, who'd sat down for just a moment's rest and never risen again. The thought of the settlers finding her frozen body in the spring, of Martha Henderson clucking her tongue and saying, "Well, what did she expect?" drove her forward with renewed determination. But determination alone couldn't warm frozen fingers or stop the violent shivers that racked her frame. The carpet bag, containing everything she had left in the world, grew heavier with each step. She'd already abandoned her mother's china teacup, wrapped carefully in linens, after the third time she'd fallen, the sound of it shattering beneath. The snow had torn a sob from her throat, one more piece of her past sacrificed to survival. Night settled fully around her, transforming familiar prairie into an alien landscape of shadows and swirling white. Every dark shape might have been a tree offering shelter, every distant glimmer a farmhouse light, but each hope proved false. The wind played tricks with sound, sometimes carrying what seemed like voices or the distant bark of dogs, only to fade into the endless howl that filled her world. Sarah's thoughts began to drift, memory mixing with the present in a dangerous dance. She saw James standing before her in the snow, smiling that crooked smile she'd loved so well. "You should have married someone richer," he said, his face sad. "Someone who could have left you more than debt and dreams." "I married for love," she told the phantom, her numb lips forming words the wind stole away. "I'd do it again." But James was gone, scattered like snow on the wind, leaving her alone in the vastness of the prairie night. Her legs trembled with each step now, and the cold had worked its way so deep she'd stopped shivering, a bad sign she knew, but the knowledge seemed distant, unimportant. The sudden absence of wind made her stumble. She'd wandered into a small hollow, the high ground around her offering brief shelter from the storm. Above, the clouds parted just enough to let moonlight silver the scene. Sarah sank to her knees, no longer certain if she was resting or falling. Her carpet bag slipped from frozen fingers, spilling its meager contents into the snow. The book of poetry James had given her lay open, its pages ruffling in the occasional gusts that reached the hollow. She stared at it, remembering summer, evenings when he tried so earnestly to read verse to her, his farmer's tongue stumbling over the fancy words. She'd loved him all the more for trying. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to James, to herself, or to the dream they'd shared of building a life together. The cold didn't hurt anymore. Nothing did. Snow gathered on her shawl, on her eyelashes. But she couldn't feel it. Sleep beckoned, promising warmth and peace. A distant light flickered through the swirling snow. Another cruel trick of the storm, she thought. But this light stayed steady, growing stronger. The sound came next. Rhythmic crunching of snow beneath heavy hooves. Sarah tried to stand, to call out, but her body wouldn't obey. The best she could manage was to lift her head, squinting against the wind that had found her shelter. The lantern light swung closer, carried by a mounted figure she couldn't quite make out. The horse's breath steamed in the frozen air as it picked its way carefully down into the hollow. Sarah wanted to speak, to reach out, but the darkness that had been gathering at the edges of her vision chose that moment to rush in. The last thing she heard was a deep voice calling out in alarm, the crunch of boots landing in snow, and then nothing. In the hollow, the wind turned the pages of the abandoned poetry book, pausing for a moment on a verse about love and redemption before carrying the words away into the night. Thomas Barrett had been riding fence lines since dawn, checking cattle before the worst of the storm hit. 20 years in Wyoming territory had taught him to read weather like others read books, and everything about this storm warned of danger. The wind had that particular howl that meant business, and the temperature had dropped faster than a card-sharp's smile. He'd nearly missed the dark shape in the hollow, if his horse, old Jake, hadn't tossed his head and snorted at just the right moment. Thomas might have ridden past, too focused on thoughts of his warm ranch house ahead. But Jake knew things about mercy that humans sometimes forgot, and so they'd stopped. The lantern light caught something glinting in the snow, a book's gold-edged pages fluttering in the wind. Then he saw her, half buried in white, still as death, but for the faintest rise and fall of her chest. A woman out here in this. The sight stopped his heart cold. "Dear Lord," he breathed, swinging down from the saddle with an agility that belied his 50 years. His heavy ranch coat was off before his boots hit snow, and he wrapped it around her before checking for life. Her pulse fluttered weak against his fingers, but it was there. Thomas gathered her slight form into his arms, shocked at how little she weighed. A carpet bag lay spilled nearby, its contents telling a story he'd seen too often in these harsh lands. A few clothes, a daguerreotype, a wedding ring tied to a ribbon. A widow, then, and by the look of things, one who'd been cast out rather than helped. "Shame on them," he muttered, knowing without asking that some settlement had decided she was more burden than blessing. He'd seen it before. Communities that talked Christian charity on Sundays and practiced cold-hearted pragmatism the rest of the week. Getting her onto old Jake's back proved tricky. She was limp as a rag doll, and he had to mount first, then lift her up in front of him. The horse, steady as always, stood patient through the awkward maneuver. Thomas arranged her carefully, making sure his coat covered every bit of her he could manage, then gathered her close against his chest. "Home, Jake," he said, turning the horse's head southwest where his ranch house waited. "And make it quick." The journey seemed endless. Thomas kept one arm tight around his unconscious charge, while the other handled the reins. He talked continuously, partly to keep himself alert in the growing storm, partly in hopes some of his words might reach her. "Stay with me now, miss," he murmured as Jake picked his way carefully through deepening snow. "Got a warm fire waiting, and Mrs. Cooper, she's my housekeeper. She makes the finest hot chocolate this side of the Mississippi. Just hold on a little longer." He felt her stir slightly at the mention of warmth, and his heart lifted. She was fighting then. Good. He'd seen too many give up when the cold got deep enough. Seen that terrible, peaceful look come over their faces right before the end. The lights of his ranch house appeared through the storm like a promise kept. He could make out Mrs. Cooper's figure in the window. She'd have been watching for him, worried about his late return. The door flew open as they approached, spilling lamplight onto the snow. "Thomas Barrett," Mrs. Cooper's voice carried even through the wind. "What in heaven's name?" She trailed off as she saw his burden. "Oh, merciful Father, bring her straight in. I'll heat water and blankets." The difference between outside and in hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't realized just how cold he'd gotten until warmth started seeping back. He carried the woman straight to the sitting room where a fire blazed in the hearth, laying her gently on the sofa. Mrs. Cooper had already stripped of its good covers. "Found her in Crow's Hollow," he explained, as Mrs. Cooper efficiently began removing the woman's frozen outer clothes. "I don't know how long she was out there, but long enough," Mrs. Cooper cut in grimly. "Her hands are bad, Mr. Barrett. We'll need snow to warm them slowly. Too much heat too fast will do more harm than good. Can you fetch some fresh snow while I get her into dry things?" Thomas nodded, grateful as always for his housekeeper's practical competence. Margaret Cooper had come to him 10 years ago, a widow herself with grown children back east. She'd made his ranch house a home and mothered him shamelessly despite being a good decade his junior. When he returned with a basin of snow, Mrs. Cooper had the young woman stripped, dried, and dressed in one of her own flannel nightgowns. Color was already returning to her face, though her breathing remained shallow. "She's young," Mrs. Cooper said softly as they worked together to pack snow around the woman's hands and feet. "Not much more than 30, I'd say. And look at her clothes, good quality once, if a bit worn. She's seen better days." Thomas nodded, studying their patient's face. Even unconscious, there was a strength there, a determination in the set of her jaw that spoke of someone used to fighting her own battles. What battles had brought her out into a killing storm with nothing but a carpet bag and a thin shawl? "We'll know more when she wakes," he said finally, standing to add another log to the fire. "For now, she's safe. That's what matters." Mrs. Cooper gave him a look he knew well, equal parts exasperation and approval. "I'll make up the blue room," she said, rising, "and put some soup on to warm. She'll need building up when she comes around." Left alone with his unconscious guest, Thomas settled into his favorite chair to keep watch. Outside, the storm raged. But in here, lamplight gleamed warm on polished wood and worn leather, on the comfortable trappings of the home he'd built over 2 decades of hard work. "You're safe now," he told the sleeping woman softly. "Whatever drove you out into that storm, it's done with. You rest easy here." Her only response was the quiet sound of deepening breath, as exhaustion gave way to true sleep. Thomas leaned back in his chair, prepared for a long night's vigil, and wondered what story he'd hear when those eyes finally opened. Sarah woke to the gentle clink of china and the smell of chocolate. For a moment she thought she was back home, before everything had changed. Then the pain in her hands brought reality rushing back, and her eyes flew open in panic. "Easy now," a woman's voice said, warm and steady as a hearth fire. "You're safe here." The room slowly came into focus, a well-appointed sitting room with dark wood furniture and worn leather chairs. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and beside her sat a woman in her 40s, holding a delicate china teacup that steamed invitingly. "I'm Mrs. Cooper," the woman said, helping Sarah sit up against the pillows. "And that fine gentleman dozing in the corner is Mr. Barrett, who brought you in from the storm last night." She nodded toward a tall man sleeping in a leather armchair, his face lined but handsome in the firelight. "How long?" Sarah's voice came out as a croak. 2 days, Mrs. Cooper replied, holding the teacup to Sarah's lips. "Drink this. It's hot chocolate. Best medicine for a frozen soul, my mother always said." The chocolate was rich and sweet, warming Sarah from the inside out. As she sipped, Mrs. Cooper explained how they'd found her, about the careful warming of her frozen hands and feet, the vigil they'd kept as fever threatened and passed. "Mr. Barrett hasn't left that chair more than an hour total," Mrs. Cooper said softly, her tone mixing approval and exasperation. "Kept saying someone should be here when you woke, in case you were frightened." Sarah looked at the sleeping man with new eyes. In her experience, men's kindness usually came with expectations attached. But there was something about this man's presence, the way he'd kept watch without demanding attention for it, that spoke of a different sort of character. As if sensing her gaze, Thomas Barrett stirred and opened his eyes. They were a warm brown, like sun touched earth after rain, and they held nothing but gentle concern as they met hers. "Welcome back," he said simply, his voice deep and quiet. "You gave us quite a scare." "Thank you," Sarah whispered, "for finding me. For—" She gestured vaguely at the room, the warm fire, her bandaged hands. "No thanks needed," he replied, standing slowly and stretching his tall frame. Any decent person would have done the same. But they hadn't, Sarah thought. The settlers she'd known, who'd called themselves decent folk, had cast her out to die. This stranger had done more for her in 2 days than her neighbors had in 2 months of widowhood. "I'm Sarah Miller," she offered, her first step toward trust feeling like stepping onto ice, uncertain if it would hold. Thomas Barrett smiled, and the ice held firm. "Welcome to Barrett Ranch, Mrs. Miller. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to heal up proper." Mrs. Cooper clucked her tongue approvingly and rose to fetch more chocolate. Sarah watched her go, then turned back to find Thomas Barrett studying her with thoughtful eyes. "When you're stronger," he said carefully, "we'd be glad to hear your story. But there's no rush. For now, just rest and know you're safe here." Safe. Such a simple word, but it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to seem weak, but Thomas Barrett's expression told her he understood anyway. "Rest now," he said, settling back in his chair with a book. "Mrs. Cooper's bringing soup later, and you'll need your strength to do her cooking justice." Sarah leaned back against the pillows, letting the fire's warmth and the quiet turning of pages lull her toward sleep. Her last thought before drifting off was that perhaps, just perhaps, not all hope had frozen that night in the storm. A week after her rescue, Sarah sat at Thomas Barrett's massive oak desk, studying the ranch's ledger with growing concern. The morning sun streamed through the study window, illuminating columns of numbers that told a story of their own. One of honest work and fair dealing, but also of opportunities missed through simple oversight. "Mr. Barrett," she called, looking up to find him watching her from the doorway. "Have you noticed that your cattle broker in Cheyenne has been gradually reducing his per-head payment? It's small enough to miss month to month, but over the year—" He crossed the room to look over her shoulder, his presence warm but careful, maintaining a respectful distance that Sarah had come to appreciate. "Show me." She pointed out the pattern, her once frozen fingers now healed enough for fine work. "Here and here, nearly 50 cents less per head than last spring. Multiply that across your usual sales." "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, then quickly added, "Pardon my language, Mrs. Miller. You've quite an eye for figures." "I kept books for my father's store back east," she explained, then hesitated. It was the first piece of her past she'd volunteered since waking. "Before everything." Thomas pulled up a chair, not pressing for more but clearly interested. "Would you consider taking on our books? Mrs. Cooper does her best, but she'll be the first to tell you numbers aren't her strong suit. We could arrange fair compensation, of course." The offer startled her. Not charity, but real work, a chance to earn her keep. "I'd be glad to," she said, trying to keep the emotion from her voice. "Though you've already done so much." "Nonsense," he cut in gently. "Good help is worth its weight in gold out here. I'd be a fool to waste such talent, especially when it's landed right on my doorstep." Later that afternoon, Sarah stood in the ranch house kitchen, sharing tea with Mrs. Cooper while fresh bread baked in the oven. The older woman had become more friend than caretaker over the past week, her practical kindness a balm to Sarah's wounded spirit. "He's never trusted anyone with those books," Mrs. Cooper remarked, sliding another piece of cornbread towards Sarah. "Eat up, dear. You're still too thin by half." "The system is sound," Sarah said, obediently taking a bite. "Just needs a woman's attention to detail. Men sometimes miss the smaller picture, focusing on the grand scheme of things." Mrs. Cooper's laugh was rich and knowing. "Don't they just? Though Mr. Barrett's better than most that way. 20 years building this place up from nothing, and he still remembers to thank every hand by name at supper time." Sarah had noticed that too, the way the ranch hands touched their hats respectfully when Thomas passed, not from fear, but genuine regard. She'd seen him help muck out stalls and mend fences alongside his men, had watched him gentle a frightened colt with endless patience. "He's a good man," she said softly, almost to herself. Mrs. Cooper's sharp eyes missed nothing. "That he is, dear. That he is." She busied herself with the teapot, allowing Sarah a moment to collect herself. "Now, about these new curtains I've been meaning to put up in the sitting room." And just like that, Sarah found herself drawn into the daily rhythm of ranch life. Her days filled with purpose, mornings spent with the ledgers, afternoons helping Mrs. Cooper with household tasks or learning the basics of ranch management from Thomas. Each small responsibility felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, building something new from the ashes of what she'd lost. The ranch hands tipped their hats to her now too, respect slowly replacing curiosity in their eyes. She was becoming more than just the woman their boss had rescued from the storm. She was becoming part of Barrett Ranch, and for the first time since James's death, Sarah felt the stirring of something that felt remarkably like hope. The photograph slipped from Sarah's fingers, landing face up on Thomas's desk. Her parents smiled up at her from the faded image, her father standing proud in his shopkeeper's coat, her mother seated with perfect posture, both of them frozen in time before illness took them. She'd found it while organizing the study's drawers, tucked among the letters and papers she'd salvaged from her carpet bag. "They would have loved this place," she murmured, surprising herself with the thought. Her mother, who'd taught her bookkeeping, between lessons in deportment and French. Her father, who'd believed education was the greatest gift he could give his daughter. They'd wanted more for her than a farmer's life, but they'd wanted her happiness most of all. The sound of hooves in the yard drew her attention. Through the window, she saw Pete, one of the younger ranch hands, riding in hard from town. Something about his posture set off warnings in her mind, the way he kept looking over his shoulder, the urgent way he dismounted. Sarah heard Thomas's heavy steps in the hallway before he appeared in the doorway. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting her expression. Before she could answer, Mrs. Cooper's voice called from below. "Mr. Barrett, you're needed downstairs." They found Pete in the kitchen, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Cooper with shaking hands. His young face was troubled as he looked up at Thomas. "Mr. Barrett, sir, was in town getting supplies when I overheard something at the mercantile." He glanced at Sarah, then back to his boss. "That settlement north of here? Their elder's been asking questions about a missing widow, saying she took money that wasn't hers before she left." The lie hit Sarah like a physical blow. "I never," she started, but Thomas's gentle hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Go on, Pete," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "They're saying they might send men to look for her. Elder Thompson, he was talking about moral obligation and community standards." Pete's disgust was clear. Funny how those standards didn't keep them from turning out. "A woman in winter." Mrs. Cooper made a sound like an angry cat. "Those sanctimonious—" She cut herself off, but her hands worked furiously at her apron. "Thank you, Pete," Thomas said quietly. "You did right bringing this to us directly. Best keep it between us for now." When the young ranch hand had gone, Sarah found herself trembling. The photograph was still clutched in her hand, her parents' faces now seeming to hold concern rather than joy. "I should go," she whispered. "I won't bring trouble to your door after all you've—" "No," Thomas's voice was firm but gentle. "You're not going anywhere, Sarah, unless you want to," he added softly. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in her chest tightened at the sound of it. "They're lying," she said, her voice strengthening. "After James died, I sold everything we had to pay our debts. Every penny went to the bank in Cheyenne. I have the receipts in my—" She stopped, remembering the spilled contents of her carpet bag in the snow. "I believe you," Thomas said simply. "And more importantly, I know Elder Thompson's kind. Men who wrap greed in scripture and call it righteousness." He shared a look with Mrs. Cooper, some unspoken understanding passing between them. This is your home now if you want it, and we protect our own here at Barrett Ranch." Mrs. Cooper nodded firmly. "Indeed we do. Now sit down before you fall down, dear. I'll make us all some tea, and we'll sort this out proper." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the photograph still in her hands. Looking at her parents' faces, she suddenly remembered something her father used to say. Character shows clearest in how folks treat those who can't help them in return. She looked up at Thomas, who'd taken the seat across from her, his solid presence as reassuring as the mountain peaks on the horizon. In his eyes, she saw not pity or obligation, but something warmer, something that made her heart beat faster, even as it calmed her fears. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me." His smile was gentle as summer rain. "Some things don't need proof, Mrs. Miller. Some things you just know." The first hint of spring came on a morning in late March when Sarah found Thomas on the front porch, studying a seed catalogue with the same intensity he usually reserved for cattle ledgers. The snow was retreating from the pastures in patches, revealing hints of green beneath winter's blanket. "Mrs. Cooper suggested we might want a kitchen garden this year," he said without looking up, though she hadn't made a sound. He'd developed an uncanny awareness of her presence lately, or perhaps she'd become more attuned to his. "Says it's not right. A ranch this size, buying vegetables from town when we've got good soil going to waste." "She's right," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside his. The morning air still held winter's bite, but the sun felt warm on her face. "Though I suspect she's thinking more about my need for occupation than your need for fresh tomatoes." That brought his eyes up from the catalogue, crinkling at the corners with amusement. "Mrs. Cooper does tend to manage us all for our own good." He hesitated, then added softly, "You know you've got nothing to prove here, Sarah. You've more than earned your place." The use of her given name still sent a warm shiver through her, though it had become more frequent in recent weeks. "I know," she said, "but I'd like to build something here, not just maintain what already exists." She reached for the catalogue, her fingers brushing his as she took it. Thomas didn't pull away from the brief contact. Instead, he shifted slightly closer, ostensibly to better see the pages she was turning. "What would you plant?" "Tomatoes, certainly. Beans. Maybe some squash." She smiled at a memory. James could never get squash to grow properly, used to say they had a personal grudge against him. It was the first time she'd mentioned James without pain clouding her voice. Thomas seemed to notice, his expression thoughtful. "And you? Did you have better luck with rebellious vegetables?" "I did, actually. My mother taught me about companion planting, which plants grow better together, like people. Some bring out the best in each other." She stopped, realizing how that might sound, but Thomas was nodding. "I've noticed that about horses," he said. "Some combinations just work, make both animals calmer, steadier. Others—" he shrugged. "Nature has her own wisdom about such things." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, passing the catalogue back and forth, making notes about seeds. To order. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, and Sarah found herself imagining summer evenings in this same spot, watching sunset paint the mountains while vegetables ripened in their garden. "I've been thinking," Thomas said finally, his voice careful, "about building a proper greenhouse off the south side of the house. Would give you a longer growing season, let you start seeds early." He paused. "If you're planning to stay that long." Sarah's heart beat faster at the implicit question in his words. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Staying, I mean. And the greenhouse." His hand found hers on the catalogue's worn pages, warm and calloused and gentle. "I'm glad," he said simply, but his tone carried more meaning than fancy words could have. "Managed." A meadowlark called from the fence post, its spring song clear and sweet in the morning air. Sarah remembered other springs, other dreams, but they seemed distant now, like paintings in a gallery, beautiful, but no longer quite real. This moment, with its mix of peace and possibility, felt more solid than any memory. Mrs. Cooper's voice from the kitchen door broke the spell. If you two are done planning gardens, breakfast's getting cold. And Mr. Barrett, don't forget you've got that meeting with the cattle buyers this afternoon." They rose, reluctantly letting their hands fall. Apart, but something had shifted, settled into place, like the last piece of a puzzle long in the making. As they headed inside, Sarah caught Thomas looking at her with an expression that matched the warmth unfurling in her own heart, part wonder, part certainty, and all promise. The new dress felt strange after months in Mrs. Cooper's borrowed clothes. Sarah smoothed the dark blue fabric, cut in the latest fashion the town's seamstress could manage. Thomas had insisted on having it made, saying practical ranch clothes weren't suitable for meeting with the bank president about their new breeding program investments. "Our investments," he'd corrected himself, making her heart skip. "Since you're the one who found the opportunity in those ledgers." Now, riding beside him in the wagon toward town, Sarah felt equally strange and right. The spring morning had dawned clear and mild, the road mostly dried from recent rains. Thomas handled the reins with casual competence, his Sunday suit making him look more handsome than usual, if a bit less comfortable. "Nervous?" he asked, glancing her way. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a while since I've faced town gossips, and this time—" She gestured vaguely between them, not quite sure how to define what this was. "This time you're not alone," he finished firmly. "And you're coming as the woman who's helped double the ranch's efficiency in 3 months, not as anyone's charity case." They rounded the last bend, the town spreading before them in the valley. Sarah sat straighter, lifting her chin. She'd faced worse than wagging tongues and lived to tell the tale. The first test came at the Mercantile, where they stopped for supplies before the bank meeting. Mrs. Henderson, not the doctor's wife from Sarah's old settlement but cut from the same cloth, stood behind the counter, her eyes widening at their entrance. "Mr. Barrett," she said warmly, then with decidedly less enthusiasm, "and company." "Mrs. Miller," Thomas supplied, his tone pleasant but firm. "My ranch manager. We'll need the usual monthly order, plus these seeds." He handed over the carefully prepared list Sarah had written in her precise hand. Mrs. Henderson's pinched expression at the word manager almost made Sarah smile. Almost. "Of course," the shopkeeper said, reading the list, "though I'm surprised you're planning such an extensive garden. Usually, men in your position—" She let the words trail off meaningfully. "Usually miss opportunities for profit and pleasure." "Alike," Thomas replied easily. "Mrs. Miller's agricultural expertise is already proving invaluable to the ranch's operations." The way he said it, matter of fact, without defensiveness, took the wind from Mrs. Henderson's sails. She couldn't very well argue with a man's right to run his ranch as he saw fit, not in Wyoming territory. Their next stop proved more pleasant. The bank president, Mr. Phillips, cared more for numbers than gossip, and Sarah's detailed presentations of their expansion plans impressed him visibly. When Thomas backed her proposal with his reputation and collateral, the loan was approved with remarkable speed. "I must say," Phillips remarked as they concluded, "it's refreshing to see such thorough planning. The territory needs more of this sort of careful growth." Leaving the bank, they passed the town's small church just as services were letting out. Sarah felt the weight of stares, heard the murmur of whispers, but Thomas's hand at her elbow was steady, and she remembered Mrs. Cooper's words that morning. "Hold your head high, dear. You've nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of." At the cafe where they stopped for dinner, the owner's wife served them with searching looks that turned approving by dessert. Perhaps it was the way Thomas pulled out Sarah's chair, or how they discussed ranch business as equals, or simply that nothing in their manner suggested impropriety. "You handled them well," Thomas said on the ride home, the wagon loaded with supplies and success. Sarah watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. "They handled themselves better than I expected, though I suspect having you beside me made the difference." "No," he said quietly. "You made the difference. You've changed things, Sarah. The ranch, the books, the garden plans." He paused. "Me." The last word hung in the air between them. full of meaning neither was quite ready to voice. But as the horses carried them home through the gathering dusk, Sarah felt something settle in her heart, a certainty that whatever came next, she was exactly where she belonged. The hand-carved wooden box sat on Sarah's desk one morning in late spring, its surface polished to a soft glow. No note accompanied it, but she knew instantly who had made it. She'd seen Thomas whittling in the evenings, his big hands surprisingly delicate with the small knife, though he'd always tucked his work away when she approached. Her fingers traced the intricate pattern of vines and leaves carved around the edges, each detail perfect down to the tiny flowers blooming among the foliage. When she lifted the lid, the scent of cedar filled the air, and she found the inside, lined with velvet, clearly ordered from the mercantile at some expense. "Do you like it?" She turned to find Thomas in the doorway, trying to look casual and failing utterly. There was vulnerability in his expression that made her heart ache sweetly. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But what's the occasion?" He moved into the room, running one hand along the desk's edge. "Saw you keeping your parents' photograph and James's ring in that little cloth bag. Thought you might want something more fitting, something permanent." The last word carried weight, and Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the thoughtfulness of this man who understood that honoring her past wasn't a threat to their future. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Thomas said, his voice gentle, "about why I understand about keeping memories close." He pulled a worn daguerreotype from his vest pocket and handed it to her. The image showed a much younger Thomas, standing beside a pretty woman in a wedding dress, both smiling at the camera. "Margaret," he said softly, "we had 3 years together before the fever took her. I was 30, she was 26. Always meant to have children, but—" He shrugged, the gesture containing years of acceptance. "She's why you stopped that night," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "Why you were riding fence lines so late in a storm." Thomas nodded. "Lost her in winter. For years after, I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else facing that kind of cold alone." His eyes met hers. "Never expected finding you would lead to this." "This?" Sarah asked, her heart beating. "Faster. Hope," he said simply. "A future I didn't think I'd want again, if that's not too forward to say." Sarah placed the photograph gently in the new box, then reached for James's ring on its ribbon. It settled onto the velvet beside her parents' picture, precious memories protected in cedar and love. When she closed the lid, it felt like closing one chapter of her life with respect, making room for the next to begin. "Not too forward," she said, turning to face Thomas fully. "I've been feeling the same way. About hope. About—" She gestured. "Between them, as she had that day in the wagon, but this time with certainty rather than question." He stepped closer, slowly enough to give her time to move away if she wished. She didn't. His hand came up to cup her cheek, calloused and warm and infinitely gentle. "Sarah," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I'm not a young man, and I'm set in some of my ways, but everything good that's happened to this ranch, to me, in the past months has been because of you. Because you make me see the world fresh, make me want to build something new." She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. "We've both had lives before this," she said. "Maybe that's why we can appreciate what we've found now." The kiss, when it came, felt like spring rain after drought. Gentle at first, then deep with promise. When they parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing the same air. "Mrs. Cooper will be insufferably pleased with herself," he murmured, making Sarah laugh softly. "She's earned it," she replied, "though I suspect she's known longer than we have." The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the polished surface of the wooden box. Inside, old loves rested safe and honored, while outside new love bloomed as natural as wildflowers after winter's thaw. The air held the peculiar stillness that often preceded summer storms in Wyoming territory. Sarah stood on the porch, watching. Thunderheads billed over the mountains, dark and heavy with promise. The newly planted garden lay vulnerable before the approaching tempest, months of work at nature's mercy. Thomas appeared beside her, his expression concerned as he studied the sky. "Never seen clouds quite that color," he said quietly. "Best get everything battened down." He turned to call orders to the ranch hands, who were already moving with practiced urgency to secure equipment and livestock. The wind picked up suddenly, hot and nervous. Sarah helped Mrs. Cooper bring in laundry and close shutters, while Thomas and his men worked to get the horses into the barn. The newest addition to the herd, a spirited mare heavy with foal, was giving them trouble, fighting the handlers despite her condition. "She's scared witless," Thomas called over the rising wind. "Sarah, could you—" He didn't need to finish. Sarah was already moving toward them, her skirts whipping around her legs. The mare's eyes rolled white with fear, but Sarah approached slowly, speaking in the same calm tone she used when reviewing ledgers with Thomas. "Easy now, lady. We're all friends here." She reached the nervous horse, letting her catch her human scent. "That's right. Nothing to fear but the storm, and we'll weather that together." Together, she and Thomas managed to guide the mare into the barn just as the first massive drops began to fall. Thunder cracked overhead like rifle shot, making the wooden beams shudder. "That's not natural," Mrs. Cooper said from the barn door, her usual practical manner edged with worry. "Mr. Barrett, the creek—" Thomas was already moving. "The spring thaw was heavy this year. If these rains are what I think—" He turned to his foreman. "Pete, get every able hand to the north pasture. If that creek floods, the new herd will be trapped." Sarah finished, understanding instantly. They'd invested heavily in premium stock, placed in the richest grazing land that, right now, was looking more like a potential death trap. The rain fell in sheets now, turning the world grey and hostile. Thomas grabbed his oilskin coat, then hesitated. Sarah knew he was torn between heading out himself and staying to protect the ranch house and barn. "Go," she said firmly. "Mrs. Cooper and I can handle things here. Those cattle are our future." He caught her hand, squeezed it once, hard. "Be careful," he said, then turned to Mrs. Cooper. "The root cellar." "Already provisioned," the housekeeper nodded. "We'll move down there if need be. Now go, before you lose the light." Sarah watched him ride out with his men, their forms quickly swallowed by the storm's fury. The pregnant mare whinnied nervously, and Sarah returned to her, stroking her rain-slicked neck. "Hush now, girl. Your man will be back soon enough. They all will." The hours that followed tested every nerve. The storm raged with unnatural vigor, wind howling through every crack in the barn's sturdy walls. Sarah and Mrs. Cooper moved between house and barn, securing what they could, comforting frightened animals and watching the creek's waters rise with alarming speed. A tremendous crack split the air, followed by the distinctive sound of rending wood. Sarah ran out into the rain to see one of the ancient cottonwoods that lined the creek listing dangerously, its roots undermined by the rushing water. "It'll take out the bridge if it falls," she shouted to Mrs. Cooper. The bridge was Thomas's only route back from the north pasture. Without thinking further, Sarah ran for the tool shed. "Sarah Miller, don't you dare!" Mrs. Cooper's voice was lost in the wind, but Sarah was already returning with an axe and rope. She'd seen Thomas and his men do this before, using guide ropes to direct a tree's fall. The theory couldn't be that different in practice. The rain blinded her as she worked, soaked to the skin despite her coat. The rope, secured to the trees, upper branches, took all her weight as she pulled, trying to angle the fall away from the bridge. Her hands burned, slipping on the wet rope, but she held on. She had to. "Let it go, girl." Mrs. Cooper's voice came through the storm. "It's too much." "No!" Sarah shouted back. "He needs this bridge." Whether she meant Thomas or the whole crew didn't matter. What mattered was holding on, fighting back against nature's fury with everything she had. Just when her strength was failing, other hands grabbed the rope behind her. Pete and two other ranch hands, returned from securing the outlying buildings, added their weight to hers. Together, they pulled the great tree away from the bridge, watching it crash harmlessly. into the swollen creek. "Mrs. Miller," Pete said with newfound respect, "remind me never to arm wrestle you." She managed a breathless laugh, but her eyes were on the bridge, watching for riders through the rain. The storm was beginning to slacken, the thunder moving. East, when she finally heard hoofbeats, Thomas rode at the head of his men, all of them mud-covered and exhausted, but alive. The cattle, she learned later, had been driven to higher ground just in time, though it had been a near thing. Right. Now, none of that mattered, as Thomas dismounted and strode toward her, taking in her soaked appearance and the fallen tree. "The bridge," he began, "is safe," she finished, "though we lost one of your cottonwoods." He looked from the tree to the rope still in her hands, understanding dawning in his eyes. Without warning, he pulled her into his arms, mud, rain, and all. "You impossible, magnificent woman," he murmured into her hair. "What am I going to do with you?" "Marry me," she said, surprising herself with the boldness. "Since we seem to handle storms better together." His laugh was rich with joy and relief. "Yes," he said simply, "though I had a more romantic proposal planned, involving considerably less mud." "This is perfect," she assured him, and meant it. They had faced nature's fury together and emerged stronger. What better foundation for a marriage could there be? Mrs. Cooper's voice broke their moment. "If you two are quite finished getting engaged in the rain, there's hot coffee in the kitchen. And Mr. Barrett, you'll want to see what your bride-to-be did to protect your investment. Pete, tell him about the tree." As they walked toward the house, Thomas's arm around her waist, Sarah felt the last lingering chill of that long-ago winter night finally fade. She had found more than shelter here. She had found strength she never knew she possessed, love she never expected to feel again, and a future as boundless as the Wyoming sky. The letter arrived on a bright June morning, carried by a trail dusty rider who looked uncomfortable with his task. Sarah recognized the flowing script immediately, Martha Henderson's distinctive hand, simultaneously elegant and accusatory. She stood in Thomas's study, sunlight streaming through windows that faced the garden, where young tomato plants reached skyward. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, weighted with more than paper. "Want me to burn it unopened?" Thomas offered from his desk, only half joking. They'd been reviewing plans for the greenhouse's construction, but his attention was now fully on her face. Sarah shook her head. "No. Whatever they're saying, I need to know." Her fingers broke the seal with deliberate care, unfolding the paper inside. "My dear Mrs. Miller," she read aloud, her voice steady, "it has come to our attention that you have established yourself at Barrett Ranch through means which I'm sure seemed expedient at the time. However, certain financial irregularities have recently come to light regarding your late husband's dealings with our settlement's bank." The letter went on, carefully crafted insinuations wrapped in concern for her soul. But it was the final paragraph that made her blood run cold. "Elder Thompson and Mr. Augustus Green from the bank will be calling upon you shortly to discuss these matters. I'm sure you'll want to resolve any misunderstandings before your relationship with Mr. Barrett progresses further." Thomas's chair scraped back. "Augustus Green," he said, the name carrying weight. "Why does that name sound familiar?" "Because he was the reason we left Ohio," Sarah said quietly, sinking into a chair. "He was the bank manager there too, the one who—" She trailed off, old memories surfacing like bitter wine. Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Tell me." "He wanted to marry me. Back in Columbus. When I chose James instead, he made it impossible for us to stay. Called in loans, spread rumors about James's business practices. We came west to escape him." She met Thomas's eyes. "I never told James the whole truth. He thought it was just bad luck with the bank. And now he's here." Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "Working with Elder Thompson. He must have followed the banking circuit west." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "What are the chances? The chances of him trying to destroy another good man's reputation to get to you? Pretty high, I'd say." Thomas stood, pacing to the window. "The timing's interesting. Just as we're expanding the ranch, making new investments, they'll try to block the loans, Sarah realized. Martha's letter, the accusations about James. It's all groundwork. They'll threaten to spread rumors, try to damage your standing with the bank in Cheyenne. Let them try. Thomas's voice held steel. I've spent 20 years building a reputation in this territory. 20 years of honest dealing and paid notes. Augustus Green's been here, 2 years? 3? Sarah stood, moving to join him, at the window. It's not just the bank, Thomas. They'll try to turn the whole town against us. Martha Henderson has a gift for that kind of thing. He turned to face her, his expression grave, but gentle. Sarah, do you trust me with everything? I am, she answered without hesitation. Then trust this. We're going to fight them, not with secrets or shame, but with truth and dignity. Everything in the open, everything above board. He took her hands again, starting with this. I want to marry you next week, not next month, as planned, before they arrive. Thomas, not to rush you, he continued, but to make it clear to everyone that this isn't some scandal they can use against us. You're not some woman I took in from charity. You're my partner in business and life. The papers are already drawn up making you half owner of the ranch. Sarah stared at him. You did that? When? The day after the storm, when you saved both bridge and herd. Seemed fitting. His smile was wry, just waiting for the right moment to tell you. Impulsively, she reached up and kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and love into the gesture. When they parted, she saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. Next week, then, she agreed, but we do this right. I want every ledger, every receipt, every bank draft from the past 2 years laid out. When Augustus Green comes calling with Elder Thompson, they'll find every piece of documentation already prepared. Thomas nodded approvingly. And witnesses. Pete was there when you found the discrepancy in the cattle broker's payments. Mrs. Cooper knows every detail of how you've improved the ranch's operations. Even that young clerk at the Cheyenne Bank, what's his name? Timothy, Sarah supplied. Timothy Wells. He's seen your work firsthand. We'll have him verify the books independently. Thomas's tactical mind was clearly engaging with the problem. We'll face them with so much evidence of your competence and character that they'll look like fools for questioning either. Sarah felt the fear that had gripped her starting to fade, replaced by resolute calm. This was so different from Ohio, from the settlement. Then she'd face threats alone, or with a husband who never fully understood the danger. Now she stood with a partner who met challenges head-on, who fought not by hiding, but by shining light into dark corners. There's one more thing, she said, moving to her desk and removing an envelope from the bottom drawer. I kept copies of the Ohio bank records, the ones that show exactly how Augustus Green manipulated James's accounts. I was too afraid to use them then, but now— Thomas's smile was grim but proud. Now we use everything, not for revenge, but for truth, she agreed. And for us. They spent the rest of the morning planning their defense, bit by bit transforming fear into strategy. Outside, the garden Thomas had helped her plant continued reaching for the sun, unconcerned with human struggles. Sarah watched a butterfly land on one of her tomato plants and thought about growth, about how some things required facing storms to grow stronger. When Mrs. Cooper brought them lunch, she took one look at their faces and nodded approvingly. About time, she said cryptically. I'll start planning the wedding feast. And Sarah, yes? Wear that blue dress from the bank meeting, the one that makes you look like you could buy and sell the whole territory. Mrs. Cooper's eyes twinkled. Sometimes the best weapon is simply refusing to look like a victim. Sarah squeezed Thomas's hand, feeling the answering pressure of his fingers. No, she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her match. Whatever storms approached, they would weather them together. The harvest festival transformed the town square into a swirl of autumn colors and lantern light. Sarah stood at the edge of the dancing area, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm, watching couples twirl to the fiddle's bright notes. Her blue dress, the one she'd worn to confront Augustus Green, now served a happier purpose, though its selection had been just as deliberate. "Mrs. Barrett," Thomas said softly, still testing the sound of her new name, "may I have this dance?" She smiled up at him, remembering their small wedding 3 months ago, how the entire ranch had turned out in their Sunday best. They'd exchanged vows under the same cottonwoods where she'd once proved her strength during the storm. But this was their first public celebration as husband and wife. "You may, Mr. Barrett," she replied, letting him lead her onto the wooden dance floor. The musicians struck up a waltz, and they moved together with the easy grace of people who'd learned to anticipate each other's rhythms. Sarah caught glimpses of familiar faces as they turned, Mrs. Cooper beaming proudly from beside the refreshment table, Pete and his young wife Claire joining the dance, Mr. Phillips from the bank raising his glass in greeting. "In quite a change from spring," Thomas murmured, nodding toward where Augustus Green stood with Elder Thompson, both men trying to maintain dignity despite their recent very public humiliation. The evidence Sarah and Thomas had presented, backed by Timothy Wells's independent audit, had not only cleared her name, but exposed Green's pattern of manipulation. "They'll recover," Sarah said, surprisingly free of bitterness. "Men like that always do, but they'll think twice before trying such tactics again." Thomas's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Especially now that you're officially half-owner of one of the territory's largest ranches. Amazing how quickly some folks' attitudes change when they realize who they're dealing with." The music shifted to a livelier tune, and younger couples took to the floor. Sarah and Thomas moved to the edge, where Mrs. Henderson, the local one, not Martha, approached with punch cups. "Such a lovely evening," she said, her earlier frostiness completely thawed. "And I must say, Mrs. Barrett, your suggestion about stocking those new calico prints has doubled my shop's income this month. I don't suppose you'd consider joining the Ladies' Business Association? We meet every Tuesday." Thomas caught Sarah's eye over the shopkeeper's head, his expression amused. They both knew how this same woman had snubbed them 6 months ago, but Sarah had learned that success, properly handled, could be more powerful than revenge. "I'd be delighted," she said sincerely, "though I hope you'll understand if I miss meetings during calving season. The ranch keeps us quite busy." "Oh, of course. How fascinating that must be. You simply must tell us all about modern ranching methods at the next meeting." Later, as they walked home under stars bright enough to cast shadows, Thomas chuckled. "I'd give it a month before you're running that association." 2 weeks, Sarah corrected, laughing. "Mrs. Cooper's already laid the groundwork. Apparently, she's been dropping hints about my business acumen at Quilting Circle for months." They paused at the edge of town, looking back at the festival lights. Music and laughter carried on the crisp autumn air, and for a moment, Sarah remembered. Another harvest celebration years ago in Ohio. She'd been so young then, so uncertain of her place in the world. "Penny for your thoughts?" Thomas asked. "I was just thinking about paths," she said, slipping her arm through his. "How sometimes what seems like an ending is really just the beginning of something better. If I hadn't lost everything that winter night, if I hadn't been stubborn enough to check fence lines in a storm." They smiled at each other, the kind of smile that comes with complete understanding. The night air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, of ripening apples from their new orchard and fresh-cut hay from their fields. Sense of home, of belonging, of a future built on truth and trust. "Shall we go home?" Thomas asked, though they both knew the answer. Sarah nodded, and they turned toward the ranch, toward their shared life, leaving the festival lights behind. The dance had served its purpose. They'd shown the town who they were together, but the real dance, the daily rhythm of their partnership, waited at home, and that was the sweetest music of all. On the anniversary of the night, Thomas found her. In the snow, Sarah stood at the ranch house window, watching another winter storm approach. But everything else had changed. The woman who had once stumbled through darkness now wore a thick shawl of finest wool, a wedding gift from Mrs. Cooper, who had declared that the mistress of Barrett Ranch should have something proper to keep. Her warm, "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Barrett." Thomas's voice came from behind her, followed by his arms slipping around her waist. He still said her name that way, like a gift he couldn't quite believe he'd been given. "Just thinking about the difference a year makes," she said, leaning back against him. "Last winter I thought I'd lost everything. Now you own half a ranch, run the most successful cattle operation in the territory, and have the ladies' business association eating out of your hand." His tone held equal parts pride and amusement. Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "Now I have everything I never knew to wish for." The greenhouse they'd built together gleamed with frost in the fading light, its glass panes protecting rows of winter vegetables. Through another window, she could see the warm glow of the barn where their pregnant mare, the same one who'd been so frightened during the summer storm, now waited to foal. "I have something for you," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. "Been working on it for a while." He pressed a small object into her hand, a new wooden box, even finer than the first one he'd made her. This one had their initials intertwined in the carved design, surrounded by tiny roses and forget-me-nots. "Open it," he urged softly. Inside, nestled on dark velvet, lay a delicate golden chain. From it hung a small clock-face pendant, its hands frozen at the exact time he'd found her in the storm. "Thomas," she breathed, touching it gently. "So we never forget the moment our time together started," he said. "Though I have to admit, getting Pete to help me figure out the exact time was quite a production. Poor boy had to reconstruct the whole night's ride." Sarah laughed, even as tears threatened. "You impossible man. Making me cry on our anniversary. Happy tears, I hope." His finger brushed one away. "The happiest." She let him fasten the necklace around her throat, the pendant settling perfectly at her collarbone. "Though you do realize this means I'll have to show you your gift early, too. I was going to wait for morning, but—" She took his hand and led him to the study, to the new desk she'd had made for him. In its top drawer lay an envelope, which she handed over with suddenly nervous fingers. Thomas opened it carefully, reading the document inside once, then again. His hands trembled slightly as he looked up at her. "A baby? You're sure?" Sarah nodded, her hand going to her still flat stomach. "Dr. Henderson confirmed it yesterday. He says early June, around the time the roses should bloom." Thomas pulled her close, his heart beating hard enough that she could feel it through his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, sharing joy too deep for words, while outside, the first snow began to fall. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "June seems a fine month for a Barrett to be born. The garden will be full, the spring calves strong on their feet. And their father will be the proudest man in Wyoming territory," Sarah finished, smiling up at him. "Second proudest," he corrected. "First place goes to being the proudest. Husband." He touched the pendant at her throat. "Though I have to say, finding you that night was the easiest part. It was convincing you to stay that took real work." "Took no convincing at all," Sarah said softly. "Just took showing me what real love looks like, what partnership means." Outside, the storm picked up, but its howl held no menace now. Within, their home, surrounded by the life they'd built together, winter's bite had no power to chill them. They had weathered storms far worse than this and emerged stronger for them. Sarah touched the pendant again, feeling its delicate tick against her fingers. A year ago, time had nearly stopped for her in the snow. Now it flowed forward, carrying them toward a future bright with promise, marked in moments like this, standing in her husband's arms, their child growing beneath her heart, as winter returned not as an enemy, but as an old friend, come to reminisce about the night their story began. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and cool, with just enough breeze to make the cottonwood leaves dance. Sarah stood at her window, watching the ranch hands setting up chairs beneath the trees where she'd once helped save the bridge. Mrs. Cooper had insisted on making it a proper celebration, inviting half the territory, it seemed. "It's not every day the most eligible rancher in Wyoming takes a bride," she'd declared, steamrolling over their protests for a simple ceremony. "And it's certainly not every day that bride turns out to be the best thing that's happened to this ranch since running water." Now, as Sarah smoothed her wedding dress, new silk from Cheyenne, but simply cut in deference to her practical nature, she heard a knock at her door. "Come in, Mrs. Cooper," she called, recognizing the pattern of 3 quick raps. The housekeeper entered carrying a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "Something old," she said, her usual brisk manner softened by emotion. "Found it in my trunk last night." Sarah unwrapped the paper carefully to reveal a delicate lace handkerchief. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate pattern. "My mother made it for my wedding," Mrs. Cooper said quietly. "I've no daughter to pass. It too, and well," she cleared her throat, "you've become family, Sarah, you and that impossible man of yours." They embraced, careful of Sarah's dress, sharing the understanding of 2 women who'd lost much but found new belonging. When they parted, Mrs. Cooper briskly wiped her eyes. "Now then, let's get you ready. Can't have Thomas thinking you've changed your mind." The ceremony itself was simple, but profound. They stood beneath the cottonwoods, their chosen family gathered. Around them, Pete served as best man, his chest puffed with pride. Claire, his wife, stood as matron of honor, her own expecting condition a happy echo of Sarah's secret. Thomas waited for her at the makeshift altar, his Sunday suit pristine, his eyes holding wonder as she walked toward him. In his breast pocket, she knew, he carried Margaret's picture alongside one of her parents, honoring the past while embracing their future. Sarah carried James's ring on its ribbon, wrapped around the stems of her bouquet, not to hold on to grief, but to acknowledge how love builds upon love, how every step of their journeys had led them here. The minister spoke of partnership, of weathering storms together, of building something greater than themselves. But it was their own words, their own vows, that brought tears to every eye. "Sarah," Thomas said, his voice steady and sure, "I found you in darkness, but you brought me into light. You've made my home truly a home, my ranch truly a legacy, and my life truly complete. I offer you not just my name and my worldly goods, but my trust, my respect, and my endless love." Sarah's voice trembled only slightly as she responded. "Thomas, you saved more than my life that winter night. You saved my faith in goodness, in possibility, in love itself. I offer you my skills, my strength, and my whole heart, from this day forward through every season to come." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that somehow felt weightless despite all they represented. As the minister pronounced them, husband and wife, a sudden breeze sent cottonwood seeds spinning through the air like summer snow, nature itself celebrating their union. The celebration that followed was everything Mrs. Cooper had promised. Tables groaned with food, fiddles played as children danced, and the ranch hands competed to tell the best stories about the couple's courtship. Mr. Phillips from the bank made a toast to their business acumen, while Pete's speech about the tree, and the storm had everyone alternately laughing and wiping away tears. As evening fell, lanterns were lit in the trees, casting golden light over the gathering. Sarah and Thomas shared their first dance as husband and wife on a wooden platform the hands had built specially for the occasion. "Happy," Thomas murmured as they swayed together. Sarah looked around at their home, their people, their life, at the ranch house that had sheltered her, the cottonwoods that had tested her, the garden beginning to flourish under her care, at the faces of friends who had become family, all celebrating not just their love, but the kind of partnership that made everyone around it stronger. "More than happy," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Complete." Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, as constant and true as the love that had brought them to this moment, this beginning. Spring came early to Barrett Ranch that year, as if nature itself was eager to celebrate new beginnings. Sarah stood in the greenhouse she and Thomas had built together, one hand resting on her growing belly while the other checked the seedlings they'd started. The morning sun streamed through glass panes, warming the rich soil where their future crops were taking root. "Everything growing as it should?" Thomas asked from the doorway, his voice carrying the same tender note it had held ever since she'd told him about the baby. "The tomatoes are especially strong this year," she replied, smiling as he crossed to join her. "Must be all that extra care you've been giving them." He chuckled, placing his hand over hers on her stomach. "Can't help it. Seems like everything around here is growing precious cargo these days." They'd expanded the ranch's operations significantly over the winter, using Sarah's careful planning and Thomas's experience to guide their investments. The new breeding program was showing promising results, their improved cattle lines already drawing attention from buyers as far away as Denver. But their most important project stood half-finished on the hill behind the main house, a nursery with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. Thomas worked on it every spare moment, incorporating special touches like built-in bookshelves and a window seat where Sarah could nurse their child while watching over their domain. "Pete says the new fence line will be done by week's end," Thomas said, his thumb brushing absently over her wedding ring. "And that young Wells fellow from the bank stopped by earlier. Says our latest expansion proposal is approved." Sarah nodded, pleased but not surprised. They'd built such a solid reputation that even their most ambitious plans were now met with enthusiasm from investors. "Did you show him the breeding records?" "Didn't need to. Your reputation precedes you, Mrs. Barrett. Seems your system for tracking bloodlines has become something of a legend in banking circles." She leaned back against him, enjoying the solid warmth of his presence. Through the greenhouse windows, she could see ranch hands moving about their morning tasks. The scene so different from a year ago. New faces had joined their growing operation, each carefully chosen not just for skill, but for character. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about starting a school once the baby's a bit older. Nothing fancy at first, just reading and figures for the hands' children. Maybe some of the neighboring ranches' little ones, too." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was truly considering it, weighing possibilities the way they'd learned to do together. "The old bunkhouse could be converted," he said finally. "Since we built the new one, it's got good light, solid walls. You've already thought about this, haven't you? Might have had Pete check the roof last week, just in case." His kiss brushed her temple. "You're not the only one who can plan ahead, you know." Sarah turned in his arms, taking in the face that had become as familiar as her own reflection, and somehow more dear with each passing day. "Have I told you lately what a wise investment you turned out to be?" "Keep talking like that," he smiled, "and I'll start thinking you only married me for my business sense." "That," she agreed, "and your extraordinary talent for rescuing women in snowstorms." Their laughter mixed with the morning sounds of the ranch, horses nickering, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the rhythmic pounding of hammers from the nursery construction. The sounds of home, of growth, of a future being, built one careful step at a time. The settlers' wagons appeared on the horizon one crisp spring morning, just as Sarah finished her morning review of the ranch's books. Through the study window, she watched them approach. 3 wagons laden with familiar faces, including Elder Thompson and Martha Henderson. "They're here," she called softly to Thomas, who appeared in the doorway as if he'd been waiting for her words. He crossed to stand beside her, his hand finding its customary place at the small of her back. "Right on time," he said. "Pete spotted them crossing the north pasture an hour ago." Sarah touched the deed in front of her, the new one that bore both their names, testament to their shared achievement. "Ready?" His smile held the quiet confidence she'd come to treasure. Always. They met their visitors on the front porch, Sarah's advanced pregnancy obvious now beneath her simple but elegant dress. She noted Martha Henderson's poorly concealed shock at her appearance. Not just the baby, but the obvious prosperity and confidence she carried like a mantle. "Elder Thompson," Thomas greeted them formally. "Mrs. Henderson, welcome to Barrett Ranch." "Mr. Barrett," the elder replied stiffly. "Mrs. Barrett, we've come for shelter," Sarah finished for him, her voice clear and calm. "The bank in Cheyenne mentioned you'd lost backing for the settlement, that the spring floods had washed out your bridge and fields." The elder's face tightened at her knowledge of their situation, but Martha Henderson stepped forward, desperation overcoming pride. "We've nowhere else to go," she admitted. "The other settlements are full, and with planting season upon us." Sarah exchanged a glance with Thomas, seeing in his eyes the same decision she'd already made. "We have rooms prepared in the new bunkhouse," she said, "and work for those willing. Our spring planting starts tomorrow." The silence that followed was profound. Elder Thompson's face worked through several emotions before settling into something like shame. "After how we treated you." "The past is past," Thomas interrupted firmly. "What matters is what we build from here." Sarah stepped forward, her hand extended to Martha Henderson. "The greenhouse has seedlings ready for transplanting. Extra hands would be welcome." Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Martha took her hand. The touch was brief but meaningful. Acknowledgement, apology, and acceptance, all in one. The settlement's integration into ranch life wasn't seamless, but it was steady. Sarah watched from her office window over the following days as former adversaries learned new ways of measuring worth, not by rigid rules or ancient prejudices, but by the honest work of hands and hearts. Elder Thompson proved to have a gift. With horses, once he stopped trying to lead through fear. Martha Henderson's knowledge of herbs enhanced their garden's productivity. Others found their places too, contributing skills they'd never been allowed to value in the settlement's strict hierarchy. "You've given them more than shelter," Thomas said one evening, finding Sarah watching the sunset paint the new community they'd built. "You've shown them a different way to live." Sarah leaned back against him, feeling their child move beneath her heart. "We've shown them," she corrected gently. "Everything here is built on partnership. Theirs with ours with each other. And love," he added, his arms tightening around her. "Don't forget that part." "Never," she promised, knowing he meant not just their love for each other, but the larger love that had transformed enemies into neighbors, judgment into understanding, and a simple cattle ranch into a place where second chances bloomed like roses after rain. Sarah sat in the nursery's window seat, their month-old daughter cradled in her arms, watching the summer sunset paint the ranch in gold. The family Bible lay open beside her, its fresh inscription recording Emma Margaret Barrett's birth, named for both their mothers, a bridge between past and present. Through the window, she could see Thomas walking back from the new schoolhouse, with Pete's eldest boy, their heads bent together over some shared discovery. The sight warmed her heart just as surely as the infant snuggled against her chest. The ranch had flourished beyond even their careful planning. Their enlightened approach to both cattle breeding and human relations had drawn attention throughout the territory. Other ranches were beginning to adopt their methods, not just for livestock management, but for building the kind of community that could weather any storm. Mrs. Cooper appeared in the doorway, carrying a fresh pot of tea and her knowing smile. "Thinking deep thoughts?" "Grateful ones," Sarah corrected, shifting Emma gently as the housekeeper settled into the nearby rocking chair. "A year ago, Thomas and I stood under those cottonwoods to exchange vows. Now, look at all we've built together." "Built and shared," Mrs. Cooper added, pouring the tea. "That's what makes it special. You two never pulled the ladder up behind you." It was true. The ranch had become a place where second chances weren't just given but earned, where work and worth were measured by character rather than circumstance. The settlers, who had once cast Sarah out, now formed the core of their expanded community, their transformed hearts proving that change was always possible when met with grace. Thomas's steps on the stairs announced his return. He entered quietly, mindful of the baby, but his eyes held the same joy they'd shown since Emma's birth. "Your son," he told Mrs. Cooper, has quite an eye for horse flesh. Billy picked out every promising colt in the new bunch. He comes by it honest, the housekeeper said proudly. His father was the same. Sarah watched them discuss Billy's prospects. This family they'd all built together. The sun's last rays caught the pendant at her throat, the one marking the moment Thomas had found her in the storm. Time's wheel had turned full circle, winter's bitter night transformed into summer's golden evening. Emma stirred, her tiny hand catching a shaft of fading sunlight. Sarah remembered another moment of desperate hope, huddled in snow, not knowing that the light approaching through the storm would lead her not just to safety, but to love. "Everyone's gathering for supper," Mrs. Cooper announced, rising. "Martha's made her famous apple pie." Thomas helped Sarah up, taking Emma so she could straighten her skirts. The baby settled against his shoulder as naturally as breathing, his big hand cradling her tiny head with infinite tenderness. "Ready?" he asked, offering his free arm. Sarah took it, feeling the strength they shared. Below, voices and laughter drifted up from the main house where their extended family waited. The sound of children playing mixed with adult conversation, horses nickered in evening contentment, and the scent of pie and possibility filled the air. "Ready," she said, stepping forward with the man who had taught her that love, like hope, could blossom even in winter's deepest night. Together they walked downstairs to join their people, their miracle daughter between them, while outside the cottonwoods whispered ancient promises of faith rewarded and hearts made whole.